joined live from Dublin by Paul Murphy. Paul's from the People Before Profit Party and sits in Ireland's Parliament. Paul, thanks for being with us on World Business Report.
Thanks for having me on.
Paul, you and the party have campaigned on this for a number of years, so I guess pretty pleased with the decision today.
Yes, definitely. I mean, we think this is a very good day for ordinary people in Ireland. Ironically, as your correspondent pointed out, it's a bad day for the government. I mean, the government has spent significant public money, about 10 million euros, to fight this case, to say, no, we don't want this 13 billion euros plus that was owed by Apple, one of the richest corporations in the world, to the state, and instead it should stay in Apple's very, very sizable cash pile. So the Irish government has been defeated, but the consequence is that now there is an extra over 13 billion euros, a couple of weeks away from a budget, a few weeks or months at most away from an upcoming general election. And certainly for us, now there's going to be a focus on, okay, what can that money be spent on with a huge housing crisis, with a huge health crisis, with inadequate action in terms of climate. Now there's a whole lot of money that could and should be used for capital investment in those areas.
Yeah, interesting, the political backdrop of it all, as you say. I mean, the government fought it, right, because successive Irish governments have really made this bet, haven't they, that attracting particularly American technology firms, some of the biggest on the planet, to come and set up shop in Ireland has been beneficial, and that they would argue, if they were here, that the benefits of employment and the people spending who are employed on those salaries was worth it for those tax deals.
Yeah, I mean, let's be blunt. Their strategy has been for Ireland to be a corporate tax haven. Ireland is a particular type of corporate tax haven. It's a corporate tax haven conduit where money flows through Ireland, out of Ireland, without any tax being paid on it. I mean, in 2014, Apple paid 0.005% of tax on its profits. All of its European sales were routed through Ireland. No taxes were paid on those. We are opposed to that model of Ireland being a corporate tax haven. We don't think it's a sustainable model. Someone else can come along, Trump, for example, and say we'll do 0.004% or 0.003%. It isn't a sustainable way to build your economy.
But in the short or medium term, how do you make that transition, though? Because literally thousands of jobs depend on these companies, and if they were suddenly to go, well, you know what, we haven't got that status anymore, we'll make the decision ourselves before someone, like you say, even offers them that. If they make the decisions themselves, a lot of people could be out of work pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's 2 points I'd make there. One is that you have to separate out the real economy, the real activities of these multinational corporations and their tax haven activities or tax avoidance activities. So if you take the companies that were at the center of this scam by Apple, it was a company called Apple Operations Europe and Apple Sales International. Those corporations had no employees in Ireland. They didn't produce any wealth in Ireland. They were simply kind of holding entities that money flowed through in order to avoid paying tax. There's a difference between that and Apple's actual real operations, where they have 5,000 workers in Cork producing Apple computers, iPhones, and so on. So those are real wealth producing activities that make money for Apple, separate from their use of Ireland as a corporate tax haven. The same applies to the other multinational corporations. And the second point, though, is this point about sustainability. I mean, we now have this 13 billion euro windfall, and that money should now be invested in order to put us on a more sustainable track. For us, that's a very different model of an economy. It's not being in hock to these multinational corporations, not trying to win a race to the bottom in terms of tax rates, in terms of regulation, in terms of data protection. That's the race to the bottom that the Irish state is trying to win. Instead, we're for a model where people come before profit, where we have public ownership, public investment of the key sections of the economy, and we plan for people's needs as opposed to always putting the corporations first.
But it is a global competition now, isn't it? We talk about this in all sorts of sectors, Paul, on the programme, in all sorts of different countries. It's not Ireland specific, is it? But countries are now in economic competition with each other to attract some of these biggest players in the world to there, because they are the wealth generators. They are the job providers, and what you call a scam, the Irish government and Apple would say a preferential tax treatments that are part of that battle, that are just part of that reality.
I mean, one thing I disagree with you on is I would say the wealth creators are the ordinary workers for Apple in Ireland and around the world. They're the ones who are the real wealth creators. But I absolutely agree with you that there is this competition between states, and is what has driven, in the context of free capital flows, it has driven average corporation tax rates down and down and down. You can look at graphs from going from the kind of mid 80s or so, the onset of neoliberalism, and corporate tax rates in real terms absolutely plummet. We say that that is a race that ultimately the only winners from are the big corporations. Different countries
Really? I
can
mean,
benefit
we're speaking to you
temporarily.
in Dublin. I mean, Dublin is a city that's transformed, isn't it, in the last decade?
Yeah, I wouldn't argue though that it is transformed on the basis of being a corporate tax haven. I mean, you can wander down to the IFSC, which is the equivalent of the City of London, and you can visit multiple buildings which supposedly host 50, 60, 100, 200 corporations, of which there isn't a light on. Nobody's working there. These are simply shell holding operations in order to avoid paying tax. Maybe there's some accountants employed to like deal with this, but that is not real wealth creation in terms of benefiting our society or even benefiting our economy. So while there may be occasional kind of short-term arbitrage type winners out of this, the long run is a shift of wealth from ordinary people, ordinary workers, taxpayers, to big, very, very wealthy, very, very powerful corporations. And we think that is a bad thing. We should resist that race to the bottom as opposed to trying to win the race to the bottom, which is what the Irish state has been involved in and has now been caught out.
What do you think should happen with this money now? What will you guys be arguing in the run up to that election you were talking about, Paul? What will you be arguing that the money should be used for? We should say that we've had a statement in the last few minutes, actually, since we've been on air from the Irish Finance Ministry, who aren't certain exactly how much of all of that money they will get, the full $14 billion that other states within the European Union may make claims on it from now. But setting that aside, where do you think this money would be best spent?
Yeah, we have an enormous housing crisis. I mean, with 14,000 people, over 14,000 on the emergency accommodation. We've an enormous health crisis, 1 million people waiting for various hospital beds. We're only slightly over half the EU average in terms of beds per head of population. And like I said, we're absolutely failing in terms of our climate targets. We're failing in terms of biodiversity crisis. And they basically are the areas that we think this money needs to be invested in. If you took all the money and invested in housing, you could build 40,000 homes. I mean, that would go a long, long way to resolve the housing crisis. You could invest it in adding significant hospital capacity, building a national health service that we need to have in this country, and you should invest it in expanding public transport, investing in free public transport, investing in retrofitting, getting people out of cars, reducing people's energy usage, and so on. So there is no shortage of things that the money could be spent on. And we think, I mean, I think it's likely the Irish state is going to say, oh, we'll pay down debt or we'll put it into a fund that'll be used in the future. Whereas we think the investment needs to be made now. And for example, if you build houses, well, you're going to get a return on those houses in terms of rent. So it will be money well spent.
Paul, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Paul Murphy there from the People Before Profit Party.